What makes you
Good
independent?
morning. I'm Chantella Mitchell, the chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting of the board. This is the 6th meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2026, and on or before September 30th, 2027. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Arpit Gupta.
Present.
Brandon Mancia. Lauren Melodia.
Present.
Sagar Sharma.
Here.
Sina Sinai.
Present.
Christina Smith.
Present.
Adon Soltran.
Present.
Maxim Nguyen.
Present.
And Chantella Mitchell, present. Let the record show that we do have a quorum. The next 4 meetings of this board will be public hearings to comment on the proposed guidelines. They will be held in person on the following dates and locations. June 4th, Jamaica Performing Arts Center, 153-01 Jamaica Avenue in Queens. June 8th, Hostess Community College, 450 Grand Concourse in the Bronx. June 11th, the Theater at City Tech, New York City College of Technology, 275 J Street in downtown Brooklyn. And June 16th, Symphony Space, 2537 Broadway at 95th Street in Manhattan. Anyone who would like to comment on the proposed rule at a public hearing must sign up to speak. People wishing to speak at the public hearings can pre-register in advance. You can pre-register online through our website, nyc.gov/RGB, or you can sign up to speak by calling 212-669-7480 from 9 a.m. till 5 p.m., Monday through Friday. You can also register to speak the day of the hearing at the hearing location from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. in Queens, the Bronx, and Manhattan, and from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. in Brooklyn. All of the public hearings will be live streamed via YouTube, and Spanish interpretation will be provided at each hearing. If you are unable to attend our hearings, you can submit written audio and video comments prior to the hearings for the board members to review through June 16th. Instructions to submit these comments are available at the board's website, by email at ask@rgb.nyc.gov, or by calling the RGB at 212-669-7480. The proposed rental adjustments are posted on our website and the New York City Rules website at http://rules.cityofnewyork.us. The final vote will take place on June 25th, starting at 7 p.m. at El Museo del Barrio, 1230 Fifth Avenue at 104th Street in Manhattan. Details can be found on the board's website. If you are interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on RGB Email Updates under Quick Links. Today, staff will present the 2026 Housing Supply Report and changes to the rent-stabilized housing stock in New York City in 2026. Copies of these reports are in your meeting folder. There are copies of these reports here today for the public, and they will be made available on our website after the meeting. Just click Research on our homepage to download these reports. After the RGB staff reports, we will hear presentations from the Mayor's Office of Equity and Racial Justice, Local Initiative Support Corporation, the Fiscal Policy Institute, and the Independent Budget Office, IBO. I will now introduce Danielle Berger, our co-research director, who will be presenting the 2026 Housing Supply Report. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you. Good morning. The Rent Stabilization Law requires the Rent Guidelines Board to consider the overall supply of housing accommodations and overall vacancy rates. Therefore, our research staff produces an annual housing supply report, which highlights year-to-year changes and trends in the supply of residential housing in New York City, with a focus on findings from the 2023 Housing and Vacancy Survey, new construction and demolition data, conversions and subdivisions, cooperative and condominium activity, housing rehabilitation, and government housing programs and funding. The major findings of this year's housing supply report are: building permit approvals for new housing units increased by 15.3% in 2025 to 17,673 permits. There was an increase of 14.3% in 2025 of units in newly constructed buildings, a total of 38,691 units. City-sponsored efforts during 2025 will add or preserve 29,735 housing units to the residential stock, 46% of which were new construction and 54% of which are preservation projects, an increase in total units of 6.3% over the prior year. Permits for demolitions of both residential and commercial buildings increased by 5.5% to 1,177 structures in 2025. And for newly certified units utilizing tax incentives, there was a 35.5% increase in the number of 421A units to 28,763 units, but a decrease of 55.0% in J51 units to 4,302. The number of Class B and Class C violations in buildings containing rent-stabilized units fell by 8% between 2024 and 2025, including a decrease of 9% in buildings built prior to 1974 that are at least 80% rent-stabilized. There were 10,469 housing court litigations reported by HPD in 2025, a decrease of 10.1% from the prior year, including a 13.6% decline in buildings containing rent-stabilized units. In addition, as of 2023, 9.2% of all rental housing is considered overcrowded. The citywide rental vacancy rate was 1.41% in 2023, and New York City had a total of 3,705,000 housing units, the largest housing stock since the first HVS was conducted in 1965. Almost 1 million of these units are rent-stabilized. Findings from the 2023 Housing and Vacancy Survey, the periodic survey of the city's housing stock, were released to the public in 2024. New York City is unique in that a significant share of its housing is renter-occupied. The HVS reports more than 2/3 of the city's available housing stock is renter-occupied, compared to 35% for the nation as a whole. New York City has almost 2.4 million rental units, and 42% of those are rent-stabilized. Vacancy rates also vary by rent regulation status. The HVS found the overall rental vacancy rate was 1.41% in 2023. Rent-stabilized units had a lower vacancy rate than the overall rental units, 0.98%, while market rentals were vacant at a 1.84% rate. The HVS also reports on overcrowding rates. The overall rental crowding rate was 9.2% in 2023. Rent-stabilized units were overcrowded at a rate of 13.1%, while market rentals were overcrowded at a 6.7% rate. As this pie chart illustrates, as of 2023, which is the most recent data, about 2/3 of New York City's occupied housing stock are renter units. The largest share is private, non-regulated rentals, 48%, followed by rent-stabilized, 42%, public housing, 7%, other regulated units at 2%, and rent-controlled units at 1%. Examining the number of building permits issued annually helps to determine the amount of new housing planned each year. Permit approvals for new housing units in 2025 increased by 15.3% to 17,673. Permits fell in 3 boroughs, including Manhattan, down 14.3% to 1,617 units. Brooklyn, down 13.7% to 5,744 units. And Queens, down 9.7% to 2,832 units. However, permits rose in Staten Island, up 45.0% to 464 units, as well as in the Bronx, up 110.8% to 7,016 units. The number of buildings newly permitted increased by 13.7% in 2025 from 793 to 902. The average size of buildings newly permitted rose from 19.3 units in 2024 to 19.6 units in 2025, a 1.4% increase. This graph illustrates that 17,673 residential building permits were issued during 2025, an increase of 15.3%. While the city overall had a 15.3% increase in permits, this map shows the number of permits by borough in 2025 and the change from 2024. As the map illustrates, both the largest proportional increase and the largest share of permits was in the Bronx. Permit data can also be analyzed more deeply by looking at the reported size of the buildings receiving permits. In 2025, a total of 902 buildings were completed. Citywide, 16.0% of these buildings were single-family, 37.9% were two-family, 9.1% were three- or four-family, and 37.0% were five-family or greater buildings. As the graph illustrates, the majority of buildings in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx were five-family or greater, while in Staten Island, virtually all buildings were either one- or two-family. Building size was more evenly distributed in Queens. Another way of measuring the level of housing creation is to look at the number of Class A units actually completed in new buildings in a given year, which in 2025 increased. In 2025, there were 38,691 units in new buildings completed citywide, a 14.3% increase over the prior year. By borough, completions were up 33.4% in Brooklyn to 18,048 units, up 17.9% in Queens to 9,608 units, and up 0.7% in Manhattan to 4,874 units, but down 12.9% in the Bronx to 5,683 units, and down 41.3% in Staten Island to 478 units. There was also a net gain of 5,879 Class A residential units via alterations, but a loss of 758 units of Class A residential housing through demolitions. This graph illustrates the number of units in newly completed buildings in each year from 2016 to 2025. As previously noted, an estimated 38,691 housing units in new buildings were completed in 2025, a 14.3% increase from 2024. Moving on to city-sponsored construction. New housing is also created by various programs sponsored by the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development and the Housing Development Corporation. These agencies reported 29,735 housing starts in 2025, an increase of 6.3%, 46% of which were new construction and 54% preservations. The location of the units by borough are Brooklyn with 29.3%, the Bronx 27.3%, Manhattan 20.8%, Queens 13.3%, and Staten Island 9.3%. By affordability level, 26.0% of the units are aimed at extremely low-income households, 25.4% at very low-income households, 27.7% at low-income households, 4.6% at moderate-income households, and 16.2% at middle-income or higher households. The 421A program was designed to encourage new construction of multifamily housing. Owners are exempt from paying additional real estate taxes on the increased value of the property due to the new construction. The current iteration of the 421A program expired on June 15, 2022, and was not renewed by the New York State Legislature. However, buildings continue to be newly certified. For the fourth consecutive year, the number of units receiving final certificates of eligibility increased, rising by 35.5%. A total of 28,763 units were newly issued final 421A exemptions in 2025, with 43.8% in Brooklyn, 20.6% in Queens, 19.8% in the Bronx, 15.8% in Manhattan, and none in Staten Island. By borough, there were increases of 9.9% in Manhattan, 57.8% in Brooklyn, and 102.3% in Queens, but a decrease of 5.7% in the Bronx and a decrease from 139 units to 0 units in Staten Island. The first 45X units, which is the 421A replacement program, were certified in 2025, including 17 rental buildings in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens with 316 units. As you can see in this graph, the number of apartment units newly receiving final certification of 421A benefits In 2025, increased for the fourth consecutive year by 35.5%. More than three-quarters of these units are in Brooklyn and the Bronx. Just less than 40% of New York City's owner-occupied housing is in the form of co-ops and condos. New or converted co-op and condo plans have to be accepted by the Attorney General's office. In 2025, the New York State Attorney General's office approved 202 residential plans with 3,525 residential units, a 22.3% decrease in plans and a 31.0% decrease in units. Similar to recent years, a majority of the 2025 plans were for new construction, a total of 137 plans with 2,519 residential units. There were also 332 units in 58 rehabilitation plans, with the remaining 674 units in 7 non-eviction conversion plans. Three-quarters of the plans accepted were located in Brooklyn, and by borough, the most units within these plans were also located in Brooklyn, with just over half the share of units citywide. Of all the accepted units in 2025, 83% were in condo plans and 17% in co-op plans. And 19% of these units were conversions, with 81% new construction. As this graph shows, the number of accepted residential units in co-op and condo plans decreased in 2025 by 31.0%. The purple bar represents the proportion of accepted units that are condos, and the green bars are accepted co-op units. As previously noted, in 2025, 83% of all accepted units were condos. Another tax abatement and exemption program previously available to owners has been the J51 program. J51 was designed to encourage rehabilitation of residential units. The J51 program expired for all work completed after June 29, 2022, but the program is still in the process of certifying abatements and exemptions for work completed prior to this date. Eligible activities included MCIs, moderate or substantial rehabilitation, and conversion from non-residential use if substantial government assistance was provided. 4,302 units were newly approved for benefits in 2025, a 55.0% decrease from 2024. By borough, 41.4% of the units were in Queens, 36.4% in the Bronx, 20.5% in Brooklyn, 1.6% in Manhattan, and no units in Staten Island. By borough, there was a decrease in every borough, including 83.2% in Manhattan, 66.6% in Brooklyn, 54.5% in the Bronx, and 41.8% in Queens. For the second consecutive year, there were no units in Staten Island. Of all the newly approved units, almost 58% were rentals. This chart shows the fluctuation in the number of housing units newly receiving J51 benefits since 2003. In 2025, 4,302 units newly received J51 benefits, a decrease of 55.0% from the previous year. This is the second smallest number of units since at least 1988, the first year for which data is available. The New York City Department of Buildings tracks the number of structures applying for demolition permits each year, which increased in 2025 by 5.5% to 1,177 residential and commercial structures. By borough, Queens had a 29.9% share of permits, an increase of 9.0%. Brooklyn had a 29.6% share of permits, a decline of 13.2%. The Bronx had an 18.8% share of permits, an increase of 42.6%. Staten Island accounted for a 15.7% share of permits, an increase of 29.4%. And Manhattan had the smallest share of demolition permits, 6.0%, a decrease of 24.5%. The New York City Department of City Planning also tracks demolitions of buildings containing Class A residential units of housing. Per that agency, demolition permits for buildings containing Class A residential units of housing increased by 80.4%, with the number of units in these buildings increasing by 86.9%. Citywide, a total of 516 Class A buildings with a total of 1,000 97 units of Class A housing applied for demolition permits in 2025. In addition, 399 buildings with a total of 758 Class A units were actually demolished in 2025. The New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD, enforces New York State and New York City local laws related to housing quality and safety. To address noncompliance with the New York City Housing Maintenance Code and the New York State Multiple Dwelling Law, the agency issues formal notices of violation to owners. HPD publishes data on individual violations daily via the New York City Open Data Portal. Each record includes details such as the building address, date of issue, violation class, the specific violation, and the current status. Additionally, the data includes the borough block and lot number, which can be used to identify buildings containing rent-stabilized units. The data presented in the Housing Supply Report focuses primarily on 3 different sets of buildings, including 2025 data for Class B and C violations for buildings of all types with at least 6 units. The change in various Class B and C violation metrics between 2024 and 2025 for buildings of all sizes that contain rent-stabilized units, and the change in various Class B and C violation metrics between 2024 and 2025 for a subset of buildings that were built prior to 1974 and are at least 80% rent-stabilized. The data includes such metrics as the total number of Class B and C violations and the change from 2024 to 2025, the proportion of buildings that have Class B and C violations, the average number of Class B and C violations per dwelling unit, and the proportion of units in buildings with no violations. This slide presents some of the data from Appendix 13 of the report, focusing on buildings with at least 6 units. As the table shows, for buildings that contain rent-stabilized units, approximately 57% of the total number of Class B or C violations opened in 2025 were hazardous Class B, and 43% were immediately hazardous Class C. These proportions are nearly the same in pre-74 buildings that are at least 80% rent-stabilized. Buildings that contain rent-stabilized units accounted for 84% of the Class B and C violations opened in 2025, with 60% of the total violations in the pre-74, 80% plus rent-stabilized subset. However, violations fell by a greater proportion in buildings that contain rent-stabilized units, 8.2%, than in buildings without rent-stabilized units, which fell by 4.0%. The pre-74, 80% plus rent-stabilized buildings fell by an even greater proportion than all buildings containing rent-stabilized units, decreasing by 9.1%. The average number of violations per dwelling unit was highest in pre-74, 80% plus rent-stabilized buildings, 0.72, compared to an average of 0.50 in all buildings that contain rent-stabilized units, and 0.26 in buildings without rent-stabilized units. As a proportion of all buildings that contain rent-stabilized units, 46% received a Class B or Class C violation in 2025, compared to 54% of pre-1974, 80% plus rent-stabilized buildings, and 19% of buildings without rent-stabilized units. The proportion of units in buildings with no Class B or C violations opened in 2025, as well as the proportion of units in buildings with an average of fewer than 1 Class B or C violation per unit, was highest in buildings without rent-stabilized units and lowest in pre-74, 80% plus rent-stabilized buildings. This slide presents some of the data from Appendix 14 of the report, focusing on Class B and C violations in all buildings that contain rent-stabilized units. As the table shows, the total number of Class B and C violations opened in 2025 decreased by 8.1% from 2024. The average number of Class B or C violations per dwelling unit declined over the past year, falling from 0.55 in 2024 to 0.51 in 2025. The average number of violations per dwelling unit generally decreases as building size increases, ranging from a high of 1.49 in 2025 in buildings with 6 to 10 units and a low of 0.18 in buildings with 100 or more units. The average number of violations per dwelling unit can also be calculated based on the proportion of rent-stabilized units and by borough. Both for buildings where rent-stabilized units comprise 80% or more of the units, as well as buildings that are 100% rent-stabilized, the average was 0.64. Geographically, the average number of violations per dwelling unit was highest in the Bronx, 0.79, and lowest in Queens, 0.26. Each borough but Staten Island saw this average decline between 2024 and 2025. This slide presents some of the data from Appendix 15 of the report, focusing on Class B and C violations in pre-1974 buildings that are at least 80% rent stabilized. As the table shows, the total number of Class B and Class C violations opened in 2025 decreased by 9.1% from 2024. The average number of Class B and C violations per dwelling unit declined over the past year, falling from 0.78 in 2024 to 0.72 in 2025, and in pre-1974 buildings that are 100% rent stabilized, the average fell from 0.84 in 2024 to 0.77 in 2025. The average number of violations per unit generally decreases as building size increases, ranging from a high of 1.68 in 2025 in buildings with 6 to 10 units, and a low of 0.31 in buildings with 100 or more units. Geographically, the average number of violations per dwelling unit in pre-74, 80% plus rent-stabilized buildings was highest in the Bronx, 0.95, and lowest in Staten Island, 0.35. Each borough but Staten Island saw this average decline between 2024 and 2025. This slide presents some of the data from Appendix 17 of the report, focusing on the number of units within various classifications of average violations per unit. Within the general population of buildings containing rent-stabilized units, 38.0% were in properties that received no Class B or C violations in 2025, compared to 23.8% of the units in pre-74, 80% plus rent-stabilized buildings, a difference of 14.2 percentage points. At the citywide level, the proportion of units in buildings averaging fewer than one Class B or C violation per unit, including those with no violations, was 91.3% across all buildings containing rent-stabilized units. Within the subset of pre-74, 80% plus rent-stabilized buildings, this figure was 83.7%, a difference of 7.6 percentage points. By borough, these proportions range from 80.7% to 96.5% for all buildings containing rent-stabilized units, and from 75.2% to 96.3% in the pre-74, 80% plus subset, with the lowest proportion in the Bronx for both sets of buildings. In all buildings containing rent-stabilized units, 8.7% of units were in buildings averaging 1.0 or more Class B or C violations per unit, nearly half the proportion in the pre-74, 80% plus subset, which was 16.3%. In all buildings containing rent-stabilized units, 5.3% of units were in buildings averaging 1.0 to 1.99 violations per unit, with 1.7% of units in buildings averaging 2 to 2.99, and 1.7% of units in buildings averaging 3 or more violations per unit. Each of these proportions was higher in the pre-74, 80% plus rent-stabilized buildings, with proportions of 10.0% of units in buildings averaging 1 to 1.99 violations per unit, 3.2% of units in buildings averaging 2 to 2.99, and 3.1% of units in buildings averaging 3 or more violations per unit. Thank you, and if there's any questions.
Thank you, Danielle. Any questions from the board? Yes, Arpit?
Thank you so much, Danielle, for the report. I was encouraged to see that we now have a few 485X buildings that are showing up in the supply counts. I was curious if the 467M programs have also shown up yet in the rent stabilization counts. These are the office conversions that should have some rent stabilization as well.
I did not request that number, but there are some numbers in the actual report that were compiled by either IBO or the comptroller that gave information about buildings that are planning that conversion. So those are in the report on page. I think page 12. But I will make a note to request that data next year from HPD.
Other questions? I had a question about the completions data. Do we get any information on the rent levels or the occupancy levels for those?
No, there's nothing beyond what is reported basically by Department. I get the data from city planning. They get it from Department of Buildings. So it's really just a record of buildings that got a certificate of occupancy. Brian will have some data on rent levels in newly rent stabilized units in his report.
Thank you. And also for the city-sponsored construction, are we able to see of the affordability levels here, the 26% extremely low, 25 very low, what that split is between new construction and preservation?
Yes, I don't want to say 100%, but I think so.
Okay,
I can get that to you if I'm able to do it.
thank you.
Shantella.
Yes, Christina?
Thanks, Danielle. I have a question if you can provide the same data during the rent freeze years of prior RGB.
Which data?
The violation
Violation
year-over-year data and also the number of HPD actions and tenant actions. So there were consecutive years of freezes or very low increases, and I'm sure the data was collected in a similar manner. So if that data could be provided, and then the HPD litigation is down by almost 14%, tenant actions are down by almost 14%, and there's an 8 to 9% year-over-year violation decline, which would be supported by the fact that this board gave an increase in last year's order. Would you agree with that?
I can't say. I mean, I think a lot of the violations is driven by who decides to report a problem. I don't think it's necessarily, you can make a definite correlation because it is driven by tenant complaints.
But it would suggest that landlords with declines across those three metrics, it would suggest that the landlords are maintaining their buildings to result in a violation decline. That's just a conclusion that I'm seeing.
Adon?
Yeah, so before I get to my question, I just want to address that. As you correctly mentioned, I think a lot of this has to do with some of the reporting issues, right? And just very quickly, anecdotally, right, we're seeing a lot less tenant willingness to file complaints because of immigration issues potentially, because of just the state of our government currently. So it is significantly harder to get folks to actually report the issues, and also in terms of the comprehensive cases that are filed by HPD, that's dependent on a lot of different things, right? Like the different mayoral administrations have had different approaches to how the department should wind up operating as it pertains to filing those cases, and also funding is a huge issue for them in capacity. So I think the reporting issues there tell a different story, right? Not just merely this idea that because RGB increases were low or that our rent was frozen, that this equates to, or rather that an increase in RGB increases translates to better conditions for tenants and less violations. The question I had is, do we have data about year over year which of the same B and C violations wind up remaining? Because what we often see is that for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, the same exact B or C violations for immediately hazardous or hazardous conditions go uncorrected.
There is some data in here in the tables. You can look at Appendix 14 and so about the sixth line down, it says proportion of total Class B C violations that are open as of May 2026. So of the ones that were opened in 2024, there's 24.1% that are still open. And the ones that were opened in 2025, there's 35.9 that are open. And the same data is in Appendix 15 for the pre-74 buildings, which is about the same proportions.
Do we have that data going back, let's say, for the last 4 years? What I'm curious to see, and I think at this point it's probably obvious, is like, of those numbers, are we going to see a pretty consistent number of the same outstanding C and B violations when there was 12% RGB increases in the last 4 years?
I can try. It's a lot for the time that's left because we're talking about, a lot of records and I'll try.
You don't have to like break your back over this.
I mean, if you could pick one year and I'll compare that year maybe to now.
For sure. I think maybe for next year, it would be
Okay.
helpful if we could have like a little bit more of a larger spread, just to have a sense of like, okay, yeah, these 7 C violations have been on the books for the last 6 years and they've gone uncorrected. I think also, and I'm not sure if we have this in here, but what's the percentage of false certifications that were found by HPD? So for anyone who doesn't know, a landlord, when they're trying to get a violation removed, they need to certify that the condition was corrected. There's an opportunity for a tenant to respond. There's issues with that process as well. But after a landlord goes and submits the documentation, presumably the violation will get lifted after an inspection. If for some reason there was a issue in that process or there was false information provided to the department, it would be flagged as false certification. And so I'm wondering what percentage of those violations were listed as false certs.
I don't believe that data is available on open data. Obviously, HPD has it, and we can talk to them and see what they can give us, but I don't think I'm going to be able to get to that myself.
Arpit?
Yeah, just kind of following up on Adon's point. So first of all, I should say I love the new violations information here. And I'm very sympathetic also to Don's point about whether or not the rental adjustments are passing on through to, changes in violations or not. Just one practical suggestion for how to do that, because you suggested like maybe 1 year of comparison might be possible. Maybe 2019 as kind of the last sort of pre-pandemic year, comparing 2 items. One would just be the total number of violations. So right now you have this year-on-year comparison, which is good, but maybe a 6-year kind of comparison of like what was the violation count in 2019 compared to now. That would kind of give us like a more longitudinal sense of how the violations have evolved without requiring you to do every single year intervening. And
I will have to add, though, the slight problem with that is that, of course, more buildings are registering now, which will not impact the data. But for new buildings that have been constructed since then, I can try to maybe leave out anything that was constructed after 2019 to make it more comparable, but it is a little bit of a problem.
Yeah, that point well taken. To also address that, I'm wondering if it's also possible to kind of try Adon's suggestion of comparing, like, of the buildings that had violations in 2019, can we see how many of those serious violations have been remedied by today or not? right? That would kind
Yeah.
of give a sense of like how much of this stock of violations is churning
Yeah,
over, or?
That's
yeah.
what I was,
Right.
that's exactly what I was,
Yeah.
my interpretation of what you were asking for, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm just seconding kind of the idea that I think that kind of comparison specifically 2019 would be great, both for this kind of stock, how much of the violations have been addressed, and also just like what was the number of violations that year.
Christina?
So you said that 75% of the year-over-year violations had been cured, if I'm not mistaken. There were 25% that still remained.
That were opened in 2024 as of May 1st, 2026. So that could have been something opened in January 2024, and then it's 2.5 years. So somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 years.
Got it. And to fully get the picture of what happens to violations after they're placed on the building, the percentage of failure to provide access data would be important as well, because a landlord can't cure a violation if the tenant isn't willing to give the landlord access. I think that's another data point that's important
That's
if we're
something
going to
we'd
talk
also have
about.
to ask HPD if they have that information.
Yeah.
Sagar?
I mean, just to respond to that point of tenants failing to give access, I think if you look at the holdovers that are filed in housing court for failure to give access, you would find a robust and diverse case log where tenants say we are giving access, and the landlords are just not, coming when we give access, and they show up randomly. So I think to use the data point of tenants not giving access would be flawed, because not every I just don't see how you would develop a uniform point due to each case being so diverse and different from each other when it comes to access.
Adon?
And I would just add, to Sagar's point, in the context of HPD violations, it is markedly different. Like, there's a factual inquiry, perhaps, about access. Like, did the tenant provide it? Did the landlord show up? What was the timing and the basis for the landlord showing up when, how, all of those factual issues. I think it's a bit different. You can still maybe make an argument of factual component, but I think it is markedly different, actually, than landlord affirmatively filing documentation to show that they were supposed to have cleared a violation, and then the department making a determination that there was a factual inaccuracy, there was either fraud or something was false about that application. I do think those are two different things, but if we want to get access on, or data on no access, then that's fine.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out, there is on page 24 and 25, the false certification. There's a little bit of data in there, so we do have a bit. 24 and 25, the HPD certification watch list.
Yeah, that is just for the buildings that made the watch list, so
Yes.
it's not comprehensive data.
But some, yeah.
Yeah.
Just quickly.
Max?
Yeah, in terms of data for the violations comparison, it doesn't feel like it would be apples to apples to use 2019 since it's pre-HSTPA. Just from a comparison perspective, how do you feel about 2020 or 2021? Like post-COVID access 2021?
Oh, I feel the challenge there is now you're like pandemic.
Yeah, the violations went way down during the beginning of the pandemic.
So 2022, that still gives us a 4-year window?
I don't know if necessarily see the impact of HSPA on violations, right? Because why are you tying it to HSTPA?
It just,
Curious.
I mean, it just feels like it sort of changed the rules of the game overall, right? In terms of, I actually do not have strong feelings about this. It just does seem like a different circumstance. But if you don't think so.
Yeah, I think the number of RS buildings probably, the number of units obviously increased because of the result of HSTPA. So, I think 2019 would be a great starting point if we can get it.
Sina?
Yeah, I was also curious whether there were like other like maybe structural features of buildings that sort of correlate with violations that we could tease out. I'm not sure what's in that data set, but I'd be curious if there were maybe other cross tabs, and if not,
Such as?
I don't know if there's like sort of I don't know, like floor count or sort of like if there's like sort of architectural features or sort of like infrastructural like issues or like kind of information about like heating or water, like sort of that distinguishes different types of buildings that would kind of, no?
Floor count maybe, but not,
Yeah.
not the other
Okay.
stuff. And it would be, at this point, it's like
Sure.
a lot.
Yeah, of course,
Yeah.
totally. Out of curiosity, how many records are there in this data set?
Well, just the B and C violations for all buildings with more than 6 units is almost 600,000
For 2025?
for 2025, for all buildings with more than 6 units.
And then
So
on open data, it's for how many years?
oh, I'm not sure what year open data starts at. I have to check that. The issue that takes a lot of time is that basically figuring out what's rent stabilized, because there's a lot of issues with the BBLs, and that's the part that really takes a lot of
Yeah,
time.
totally. Yeah, thank you.
Other questions from the board? Adon?
I just had one question, and I'm hoping maybe Andrew can answer it because he's pretty good with this. I can't recall right now, but in the HCR answers from this year, they had a section on demolition, approved demolition applications, or no?
No, it was the
No.
follow-up. Let me, I have, give me,
The reason why I'm asking is because I saw that the number of permit issuances for this year
Yeah,
for demolition
I have the rent stabilized data in here, in the demolition section.
from the, so the.
Not from HCR, from.
Yeah. So the reason why I bring it up is because what we've seen in practice in the, housing law litigation world is that there have been many instances where landlords of rent-stabilized buildings will file for DOB permits to either Frankenstein or seeking demolition. And since there's no active communication between DOB and HCR as to what's going on that front, they can get the permits approved from DOB and then start the actual work. And only until a tenant realizes, hey, they're doing this massive construction or demolition on my building, and then they, if they can, either afford a lawyer or get legal services to then stop that process, some landlords are just like pushing it through after getting the approval from DOB without getting the necessary approval from HCR, which is required by law. So I'm trying to
So I found actually demolished in 2025 that there were 8 rent stabilized buildings with total of 99 units of housing
that have been demolished.
that were actually demolished in 2025,
Okay.
based on the borough block and lot number and the HCR registration database.
Got it. Okay.
Other questions? Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.
All right. Next, I would like to introduce Brian Hoberman, RGB Co-Research Director, who will be presenting the changes report. Welcome, Brian.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. I apologize again for my voice. It's still acting up. Rent regulation has been a persistent feature of New York City's housing market for over 8 decades, although the laws governing rent-regulated housing have undergone significant change over time. In addition to legislative changes, the existing laws allow for dynamic changes in the regulatory status of a significant portion of the rent-regulated housing stock in any given year. The figures presented in this study reflect the additions and subtractions of dwelling units to and from the rent stabilization system in 2025. These figures are estimates, as they do not encompass every unit added or removed from the stabilized stock since 1994. Instead, they represent a minimum count of newly regulated and deregulated units during those years. In 2025, at least 11,464 housing units left rent stabilization, and approximately 32,745 units entered the stabilization system. The vast majority of units added were the result of the 421A and 485X programs, which comprised 94% of the additions. Adding the units entering stabilization and subtracting the units removed from stabilization resulted in a net increase of 21,281 units to the stabilized housing stock in 2025. The 32,745 units entering stabilization, along with the 21,281 units that increased in the net increase in the number of stabilized units, signify the largest increases since the RGB commenced collecting annual data in 2003. Since 1994, the first year for which we have data, a total of at least 243,443 units have been added to the rent stabilization system, while a minimum of 360,914 stabilized units have been deregulated for an estimated net loss of at least 117,471 rent stabilized units over the last 32 years. Since newly constructed apartment buildings are funded with private financing, they are exempt from rent regulation, while units constructed or rehabbed with government subsidies are rent regulated. Programs and events that lead to the addition of stabilized units include the following: 421A program, 485X program, other additions funded with government subsidies, including Articles 11, 14, and 15 of the Private Housing Finance Law, PHFL, rent-controlled apartments converting to rent stabilization, Mitchell-Lama buyouts, lofts converted to stabilized units, and the J51 program. Tax exemption and abatement programs have a considerable impact on the inventory of stabilized housing. In 2025, an estimated total of 29,456 units were added to the stabilized stock through the 421A program, 30% increase from the prior year. The largest proportion of units were in Brooklyn, with 46%, followed by Queens with 25%, the Bronx and Manhattan with 14% each, and Staten Island with fewer than 1%. In 2025, 1,203 units were added to the stabilized stock through the 485X program, which has superseded the 421A program. The most 485X units were added in the Bronx with 52%, followed by Brooklyn, 31%, Manhattan, 10%, and Queens, 7%. None were added on Staten Island. Other additions to the stabilized housing stock in 2025 include Articles 11, 14, and 15 programs added 1,734 units in 2025, down 45% from the prior year. 229 units that were decontrolled became rent stabilized in 2025, 13% more than the prior year. 104 Mitchell-Lama rental units became rent stabilized, compared to none in the prior year. And 19 loft units entered the rent stabilization system, up from 15 in the prior year. Summing up all the additions, the 32,745 additions to the stabilized stock in 2025 represents 26% more than in the prior year. Of these initially registered rent-stabilized apartments, the median legal registered rent was $2,146, a 31% decline from the prior year. Examining the number of stabilized units added by borough, Brooklyn saw the most additions with 45%, followed by Queens with 25%, the Bronx and Manhattan, each with 15%, and fewer than 1% on Staten Island. Now we'll move on to the subtraction of units from rent stabilization. Deregulation of stabilized units occur because of statutory requirements or because of physical alterations to residential dwellings. Events and programs that have led to the removal of stabilized units include the co-op and condo conversions, expiration of 421A and J51 benefits, substantial rehabilitation, conversion to commercial or professional status, as well as other types of losses. In 2025, units were removed from the stabilized housing stock for several reasons. Expiration of 421A benefits resulted in the removal of 2,708 units from the stabilization system in 2025, down 15% from the prior year. Co-op condo status conversions, which include both newly converted units as well as stabilized tenants vacating apartments in previously converted buildings, totaled 746 units in 2025, down 9% from the prior year. 278 units were removed from stabilization through substantial rehabilitation, down 45% from the prior year. The expiration of 421A benefits resulted in the removal of 209 units, down 37% from the prior year, and no units were converted to non-residential use compared to 2 in the prior year. An owner may also register units as permanently exempt when certain 421A units upon vacancy reach a certain rent level, or when the building is condemned or demolished. A majority of these units were 421A units without income restrictions that upon vacancy reached the market rate threshold exemption, the MRTE, which was $3,124 in 2025. HCR annual registration data shows that 7,523 units were removed from the stabilized housing stock in 2025 due to these reasons, 22% more than in the prior year. So summing up the subtractions, 11,464 units were removed from stabilized housing stock in 2025, 4% more than in the prior year. Brooklyn and Manhattan saw the largest proportion of subtractions, with 34% each, while 21% were in Queens, 12% were in the Bronx, and fewer than 1% on Staten Island. This table, which is also in the report, shows the total number of additions and subtractions from all the programs in 2025. It includes the 32,745 additions to the stabilized stock and the 11,464 units removed from stabilization. The difference between the two results in an estimated net increase of 21,281 units to the stabilized housing stock in 2025. The 32,745 units entering stabilization, along with the 21,281 unit net increase in the number of stabilized units, both signify the largest increases since the RGB commenced collecting annual data in 2003. And this graph, which is also in the report, shows the estimated annual change in the total number of rent-stabilized units since 2003, when the RGB first examined this data on an annual basis. In 2025, shown on the far right, there was an approximate net increase of 21,281 units, the largest net gain in any year in this period. Thank you. I will now take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Brian. Questions from the board?
Yeah, thanks,
Sina?
Brian. Yeah, I have two questions. One is, just looking at sort of like the proportion of units added, I think on the sixth slide. I'm just curious if you have like any theories as to why new units are sort of proportionally being added more in the Bronx under 485X than 421A. It's like almost like a fourfold increase. And then I guess the other question I have is, what percentage of the new 421A construction has a kind of market rate threshold exemption sort of condition that it might hit? It's like, is that the 16, 421A?
Yes,
16?
421A 16. Mhm.
And is that like kind of operative for all of those units, or is that just a subset, or this?
Yeah,
many-
yeah, the 421A16 superseded what was called 421A 1 through 15. So more recent units are going to be probably more likely to 421A16, so they would have the market rate threshold exemption.
And that's for all of the, like, kind of,
It's not necessarily for all, I think it's,
Some of the 421A units are income restricted, so those stay. in
yeah,
that same-
oh yeah, I mentioned that, right, income restricted.
in perpetuity, right? Yeah, yeah.
They call it
Yeah.
permanently affordable.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the first part of your question, 421A, 485X is a more recent, is a more ongoing program. So as you go on, you can have more of those and fewer of the 421A. But the 421As can still be, if they broke ground before a certain date, they can still qualify.
Right,
the
and
program.
I think that's showing up in the data because we're seeing the spike of people filing permits right before the cutoff date. Those are all coming online now, so there's a spike in 421A units in the data.
Yeah. I had a related question, if maybe not now, but since the majority are tied to 421A and 485X, could we do an estimation of the stabilization duration? Because especially since most of the subtractions are also due to the MRTE, I'd be curious to know if, as we're seeing these larger numbers, how many of those are temporary?
This data is all from DHCR. I don't think they track that, as far as I know. We can ask them, but I highly doubt it.
Thank you. Other questions? Oh, Arpit?
Just a similar comment as with Danielle's presentation, which is you're going to get a new column next year with 467M.
Other questions from the board? I had another question about the median rent decline. Do we have insight? Is that because the borough mix is different and they're just in lower rent markets? Or like, is it the same programs that are just having lower rents? I'm curious kind of what's driving that.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have anything beyond this in terms of the reason for the decline. It has fluctuated in the past before,
Okay.
so I guess it just is it depends on what the program is, and I guess the income, the rent restrictions as related to income restrictions in the buildings, in the mix of buildings they're putting up.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Oh,
I just had one
yes,
more question.
Adon?
In terms of the substantial rehabilitation numbers for losses of units, is that inclusive also of substantial like alteration? Because the law treats them not exactly the same. So like taking an individual unit out based off of substantial alteration as opposed to an entire building for a sub-rehab?
Substantially altered, I don't know if that's right. It has
Yeah,
to be
it's-
the entire building for substantial rehab, I think.
So, yeah, but there's a section of the law and through the guidance of HCR where you can charge a first rent when you meet certain changes to the parameter, like the actual size of the unit and like the exterior perimeter walls.
But I think it becomes
Is it
rent
broken
stable.
out or is it just?
That's not a thing anymore. So combination units, you're talking about?
No, so like there's a body of case law, I know because a case actually was just decided this past week in the Bronx about this issue, about landlords trying to charge the first rent based off of this notion of combining, I think, a studio and a one bedroom. I don't have all the facts in front of me, but I know that it's under the previous HCR guidance 95-2, but it's a carve out that's separate and apart from a sub rehab.
So if you combine two stabilized units, you have a stabilized unit. If you touch a free market unit and a stabilized unit, you have a stabilized unit. So
Right.
I'd love to read the decision. I don't know that there's a construct in the law anymore for any alteration to result in a free market unit. You get a first
So,
rent,
yeah.
but it's a
Perhaps the case might predate the change in the regulations.
I'll double back.
Other questions? Thank you,
Okay,
Brian.
thank you.
All right, and now I would like to welcome the Mayor's Office of Equity and Racial Justice. We'll be hearing from Deputy Commissioner Dabash Nagash and its Senior Advisor Shahab Chowdhury. Welcome.
Shantala? Shantala?
Yeah.
Just by way of clarifying the record, I double-checked, and in fact, it's a matter of increasing the actual, it remains stabilized under the same provision of the law about sub-rehab, but it actually would drastically increase the rent. But it remains stabilized after the fact if you meet the standard, so, yep.
Thank you. All right. Welcome.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Good. Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Chair. Good morning, all board members. My name is Shahab Chowdhury. I'm a senior advisor at the New York City Mayor's Office of Racial Equity and Justice. We refer to it as MOERJ. I am joined today by my incredible colleague, Dabash Nagash, Deputy Commissioner at MOERJ, who will pick up the policy section towards the end. We're really grateful for the invitation to testify, and we're here today simply to explain what it costs to live in New York City. Over the past few weeks, this board has heard from some of the city's strongest institutions on the question of affordability. You heard strong data on operating costs, on owner expenses, and on the condition of rent-stabilized stock. What we haven't heard yet is a true cost of living measure for tenants. The True Cost of Living Measure, or TCOL, as you'll see referred to throughout the presentation, is here to fill that gap. The headline we released last month was really direct in releasing sort of New York City's first inaugural True Cost of Living Measure. 62% of New Yorkers, over 5 million people in New York City, cannot meet the true cost of living in this city. Over the next 20 minutes, I'll walk you through sort of the true cost of living, how it was built, what data we drew from, and what we found. And then Deputy Commissioner Nagash will then walk you through what those findings mean for the policy levers in front of this board. I just want to give a special shout out to also the Urban Institute, who we collaborated with for this measure, specifically Greg Ox and Ilham Dehri. They were crucial to this work and are active collaborators for this.
And if you're able to speak up just a little bit, I don't know if the mic is.
Oh, yeah? Is this better?
Yes.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Best way to test this is, can you hear this? Let's go, Knicks. Okay, beautiful. All righty. Well, got game two. So before we sort of dive in, I want to start off with the mandate. So the true cost of living begins with a mandate from voters. In November 2022, New Yorkers approved 3 historic racial justice ballot measures with 81% of support. One created a statement of values in our city's preamble, dedicated towards guiding how the city carries out its duties. 2, a second created MOERJ as a permanent office in the city charter, instituted racial equity plans citywide for the city and the city's Commission on Racial Equity. And then 3, it directed the city to develop and publish a true cost of living measure. That third measure is the mandate behind what we are presenting today. It is what New Yorkers, by the ballot, so of the people, for the people, by the people, asked the city to build. And over 81% of them supported this measure. What does it cost to live with dignity in New York? It's not just to survive. It's not just to clear the federal poverty line, which was calibrated in the 1960s against a food and housing basket and indexed ever since. But what does it mean to actually cover what a household needs in 2026 to live a dignified life? That is what the true cost of living is built to answer. So New York City became sort of the first major American municipality to publish a true cost of living measure at this scale. We built it on national precedents. We used the foundation of the Urban Institute's True Cost of Economic Security at the national level. We adapted its methodology, calibrated it to New York's cost, and built it on the ADIS simulation model. And in doing so, what we wanted to do is we wanted to use sort of the best research out there to determine costs for New York City across various household sizes and types, age groups, and essential areas of need. We wanted to really think about important cost category areas needed to access dignity, right? And that includes emergency savings and thinking about costs of debt. And that we want to also really view this in terms of what it looks like based on the various age groups and on specific populations, including individuals with disabilities, and the kind of costs that individuals with disabilities face through caregiving. Our approach was to build it off of 5 principles to capture all costs, 12 category areas, including housing, food, healthcare, childcare, and more, and we'll get to that in a bit. We wanted to use high quality public data. We wanted to measure all resources, so that includes earnings and wages and tax credits, benefits a household qualifies for. We wanted to vary it by borough and household type, and then also grounded in the experience of New York families, the lived experience of what New Yorkers are experiencing right now. In doing so, what we have here is we kind of have the cost side of what we did to build this measure. The true cost of living counts 12 categories grouped across 8 dimensions. And here's where each one comes from. For housing, we used the New York City Housing Vacancy Survey, the same New York City Housing Vacancy Survey that was talked about by HPD team a couple of weeks ago with Liz Gomer and Lucy Joff. And it's a gold standard of housing costs in New York City. We have food from the USDA low-cost food plan, adjusted to New York City's borough prices using Feeding America's Map the Meal Gap data. We have transportation and other essentials from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, consumer expenditure surveys. We have healthcare premiums from the Kaiser Family Foundation, health insurance marketplace calculator at the Silver Plan, and then we also have medical out-of-pocket expenses from federal cost data. We have childcare from New York City's from the Department of Labor's database. We have taxes, which are calculated against each household's actual income through the ADIS simulation model. And we have savings drawn from sort of best practices and financial security guidelines. And all these sources are publicly available as either federal, state, or city, and at a county level. So on the resources side, the true cost of living counts for everything that that a household has or a family has for resources. So we start with wages, right, which is it's the biggest means in terms of resources for families. We look at also business income and retirement from the American Community Survey. We then look at other non-market resources, really important government supports, including SNAP and WIC, the federal and state EITCs, the child tax credit, Medicaid, CHIP, New York City Care, child care subsidies, energy assistance like HEAP, federal and city housing vouchers as well. We model that and whether each household qualifies and uses each program in collaboration with the Urban Institute, and that same data, same model architecture, and same methodology is something that we apply here. So we're looking at government supports, we're looking at what folks are earning as well. So to start off, before we dive into the findings, I wanted to just share a little bit of a heuristic of what we mean by meeting the true cost of living. So on the left-hand side, we have what it costs, right? We look at housing and food and healthcare and childcare and disability care and transportation and technology and student debt and taxes and savings and other key essentials and that are important, whether that be and accounting for those things. That could be attending a daughter's quinceañera or going out to eat in New York City, which we know it's both a vibe, but it's also expensive. So we want to understand. We want to understand. Then that's costs on one side. We then look at what you have, so what folks are bringing in to bring that in. That's earnings and income from all sources. It also includes Social Security and Medicare. It includes tax credits and public benefits and other New York City programs that we've talked about and family provided care. And then if what you have does not meet what the cost is, so if it falls short, it means you do not meet the true cost of living. So each family type that we're going to look at and talk about has a different threshold, right? The threshold is what the annual cost to cover these essentials that we are saying are needed for a dignified life, and it's based on borough and family type and age. The thresholds vary, right? So as I mentioned before, there's no one single number, and the resources include everything that we've talked about. So this is looking at full economic security. So we're just going to start off first to concretize this and make this real, is like, here's what it looks like for one specific median family type. So this is for the median family for families with children to live in New York City, what their costs are. So family with children, adults under 65, what their median costs are, what their median resources are. On the left, you'll see a stack. It's a cost stack. So it's costs about, and the median total cost for families with children to live in New York City is $159,197. So housing is $26,704. Healthcare is $27,500. Other essentials is $24,500. Taxes is at $15,637. Other essential savings is at $14,500. Childcare is at, this is a median cost again for all families with children children under age of 18, $13,400, and transit is just under $10,000. So on the right, you'll see the total resources. So that's $124,007. So that's what families are bringing in through earnings, and so also the calculation after every benefit and after every tax credit and other resources are calculated. And so this is a median of what it looks like for families with children to live in New York City. Now for the citywide findings. This is our, what we've been talking about, the headline, is I'll work through three pieces here. So first, the scale, how many households are falling, or not able to meet the true cost of living. Second is the distribution, who is short and where. And third is the populations that carry the steepest gaps in being able to meet the cost of living in New York City. 62% of New Yorkers do not meet the true cost of living. It is more than 5 million people. It is 3 times higher than the New York City Gov poverty measure, which has it at 20.5 percentage points of folks who are experiencing poverty, and that the true cost of living here reveals sort of the full scope of economic security. The thresholds themselves kind of share a little bit more of how these costs vary, right? So for a single adult, no kids, the median cost for single adult, no kids is at $70,344. $334 for a typical family with children, or two adults, two children, it is at $166,000. And for older adults, it's at the median total cost is at $123,000. And so these thresholds sort of break down the different costs that people face, and they vary, right, based on what folks need. And so what I want to do is we want to just start off by looking at sort of what the thresholds are and break them down by the median, by the three major family types within this measure. So for working age adults without children, the median total cost is $106,346, and housing, healthcare, and taxes are the largest sort of costs that this particular family type faces. For families with children, the median jumps to about $159,197, and childcare adds as a significant cost driver for this, in addition to food and healthcare. For older adults, older adult households, so adults aged 65 and older, the median is $123,089, and healthcare and housing are dominant costs there. So the pattern is consistent across all three, and that together we see that housing, as you can see, is the largest cost driver that families are experiencing. So what does it mean to fall under the distribution, right? So we said that 62% figure is not one block. It breaks down into multiple tiers of what the distribution, true cost of living distribution looks like, of who is able to meet the true cost of living. So we have 62% of New Yorkers who do not meet the true cost of living, and so are somewhere within that, underneath that the threshold there. We have 30% of New Yorkers who are above 110% of the true cost of living, and they're comfortably above the threshold. There are 8% that sit at between 100 and 110% of the true cost of living. That means they have 100 to 110% of the resources they need to meet the cost of living. There are 8% of New Yorkers who have 90 to 100% of their needed resources. They meet every cost in this true cost of living measure except for savings. They pay the rent, they buy groceries, they have no buffer. There are 15% of New Yorkers who fall within sort of 75 to 90% of the resources they need to meet the true cost of living. And then there are 25% of New Yorkers who have 50 to 75% of the resources they need to meet the true cost of living. And there are 13% of New Yorkers who have less than half of what they need to meet the true cost of living. These are not a few high cost outliers. These are sort of the strain is what you see here. It is structural. And so it's the same picture here, but we want to kind of visualize what it means then to look at costs and then to look at resources. And so what you see here is that for a single adult, their median costs are at $70,000. And then their median resources, so what they're earning or bringing in for New York City, is at $58,000. And so there's a $13,000 gap, or a resource gap, as we're calling it. For families with children, the median, they're bringing in $159,000 for costs. Their costs are $159,000, and then what they're bringing in is $124,000. So there's a $35,000 gap there. For two adults, two children, $166,000 is what it costs, and $141,000 is what families are bringing in for their resources. And so this row shows every row here shows that median costs above median resources. There's only one family type in all of New York City where median resources are slightly above median costs, and that is two adults, no children. So we want to now look at distribution by borough. So the true cost of living rates range about 27 percentage points across boroughs. Citywide, it is 62% for New York City total. In the Bronx, it is 75%. In Brooklyn, it's 61%. Manhattan, 56. Queens, 61. Staten Island, 48. No borough. What we see here is that, and this is just really important. Like Bronx stands out. 75% of Bronxites do not meet their cost of living. So their resources do not, so 3 out of 4 Bronx residents do not have enough resources to meet their existing cost of living. And it's unique to call out and point out is that while the Bronx has lower, from a borough perspective, has slightly lower costs, it also has much lower resources, which is where we see this arise. And so this pattern becomes a little bit sharper when we start looking at what racial disparities exist and look like within boroughs. And so you see that the racial inequities or the disparities on affordability here are wider than the gap between boroughs per se. So in Manhattan, the true cost of living rate is 33 percentage points for white residents. For Hispanic Latino residents, it is 85%. For black residents, it is 80%. There is a 52 percentage point gap inside this one single borough. So the difference is what residents bring to the costs. And that's everything from the things that we've talked about, earnings, wealth, intergenerational asset transfers. So we know that families face some of the steepest gaps between what they need and what they have. So 73% of New York City's children live in households that do not meet the true cost of living. It's the highest rate out of any age group. It's roughly 1.2 million children. Compare that to 59% of the working age adults, or the 61% of seniors who do not meet their true cost of living. The patterns sort of sharpen by household composition. We see that for a single earner with one child, 84% do not meet the true cost of living. With a single earner, 2 children, it's 94%. And so we see sort of what this pattern looks like compared to 2 adult households. And so with that, and I just want to point this out. There's a $48,000 annual resource gap that families with children experience in terms of what they need versus what they have. And so it's a significant gap in that way. Disability, nearly double, individuals with disabilities face double the cost of living in New York City. Families with any disability member face about an 80% true cost of living rate. For families with a self-care disability under age 65, the rate climbs to 92%, the highest of any population group we measure. The median annual disability-related costs are $55,400. For a family with self-care disability under 65, that single cost category area exceeds the entire resource gap for most other family types. Just wanted to really point out and emphasize the kind of costs that individuals with disabilities face. These costs arise specifically from caregiving as well. So these are some of the most affordability constrained households in the city. And just want to call out that when we look at multi-generational households, families with student debt and multi-generational or 3-generation households also have 2 of New York City's highest true cost of living thresholds, so their costs in terms of what they need. And so for 3-generation, multi-generational family households, it is $191,200, and 64 do not meet the true cost of living. For families with student debt, it is their cost threshold is $177,800, which also includes student debt costs here, and 59% do not meet the true cost of living. Families with student debt and children have slightly smaller gaps than many of the other household types in sort of the true cost of living measure at $25,300 in terms of what they need versus what they have. So their gap is $25,300. And so we see that Manhattan in particular faces significantly higher 3-generation household costs compared to the citywide average. terms of wage adequacy, just wanted to point out that the true cost of living threshold for a single adult without children in New York City is $70,334, and the full-time minimum wage in 2022 was at $15 an hour, 2,000, because our data is sourced using the year 2022. And so when we look at it, there's about 44% wage adequacy in this. And so while the state minimum wage has risen to $17 in this year, to clear the threshold on minimum wage alone, a single adult would need to work equivalent to 2 full-time jobs. So wages are a real lever, but alone cannot close the gap. One last methodology note that I just wanted to point out. We know that rent burden is an incredibly important metric in understanding affordability, but the true cost of living really provides a comprehensive framework to understanding household costs alongside rent burden. We're able to look at total essential costs and compare that to total available resources. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to capture what housing and healthcare and childcare and food and the full bundle of what a household needs, what that looks like after understanding what households actually receive and what the variations look like by borough, household composition, and age. So the true cost of living really helps to answer this question of, can this household actually cover everything it needs? And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Debash.
Great. Hello, good morning, everyone. Still morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is, as Shahab shared, my name is Debash. I serve as Deputy Commissioner at the Mayor's Office of Equity and Racial Justice. Very good to be with you all. Thank you again for having us. Shahab took some time to really walk through the methodology to show you exactly where, well, let me say this. We wanted to provide you with some profiles here to really go beyond the numbers and help you understand and just really take a closer look at what does this actually mean for New Yorkers. So we'll just look at each of these households so that we really just humanize this. So I'll start with the one on the left there. Excuse me. So this is Marisol. She is a home health aide living in the Bronx and is a single mother of 2 children. She takes the M15 bus across the borough at 6 in the morning for work, and her family has been in a rent-stabilized 2-bedroom in Mott Haven since her mother signed the lease in 2008. The true cost of living for her family is $142,000 a year. Between her wages and every benefit she qualifies for, she puts together roughly $63,000. She's short almost $80,000 a year, every year, after all costs are included, as well as resources. Her stabilized rent is roughly $2,000 a month, below the market rate for a comparable 2-bedroom in her neighborhood. That difference is what keeps her family in their home. So Marisol is one, we'll speak to the other 2 in a moment. Marisol is one household of this 73% of children in the city that are below the true cost of living, so live in a household below the true cost of living. For Marisol, every dollar of rent increase is a dollar that may be missing to support other costs, including things like groceries, co-pays, other costs. So moving to the one in the center here, in a slightly different household, you see Mr. Williams. He is 72. He has lived in the same Manhattan walk-up since 1991. His resources include Social Security, Medicare, a small union pension from his years as a transit worker. The cost of living for a single elder in his configuration is about $56,000. He has 32. So he is about $23,000 short each year. His rent is roughly $1,400 a month. A comparable market unit in his building rents above $3,200. He is also one face of 71% of single elders in the city that do not meet the true cost of their true cost of living. Mr. Williams cannot necessarily increase his income, so some of the things that I mentioned as his resources, Social Security, his pension, are generally fixed. A rent increase comes directly out of other costs. So again, as I mentioned for the other household, Marisol, things like food, medication, et cetera. And then the last I'll speak to on the right here is Marcus and Jenna. So this is Marcus and Jenna, a bus mechanic with the MTA and a school secretary in District 17, two children within the household, a stabilized two-bedroom. They live in a stabilized two-bedroom in East Flatbush. So two full-time incomes that bring home about $120,000 a year combined. They are about $46,000 short a year of what their TCOL is for a family of four. Their stabilized rent is roughly $2,150 a month. So a comparable non-regulated two bedrooms on their block rent for around $3,400. They are also one face of the 67% of two adult households with children that are also unable to meet the true cost of living. So you can see three households, $23,000 short, $46,000 short, and $80,000 short. All three already living in rent-stabilized apartments, and all three on the edge of what their housing line really allows. These are just some of the New Yorkers that the rent guidelines, that rely on the rent guidelines and their homes. So we'll move to thank you. So to just speak to some of the levers that move the TCOL. The TCOL is, as Shahab shared, a measurement. It tells you what New Yorkers need to live in this city and what they actually have and how large their gap is. It helps us understand which levers could work together to help close gaps. So I'll speak to each of these for just a moment. So first you have wages. As Shahab showed, the New York City minimum wage now covers about 44% of the single adult TCOL threshold. So that is a real lever, but obviously the cost floor in the city sits above what most people's wages reach. So wages alone cannot close the gap. The second on the right there is transfers. So looking at the resource side and the safety net, every program in the safety net combined helps to lower TCOL rates and really work together to do that. So that includes some of the things mentioned there on the screen in front of you: SNAP, federal and state EITC, child tax credit, city FEPS, and others. Every one of those programs is already helping to keep New Yorkers above the true cost of living or close to it or near it. Expanding eligibility, take-up, and benefit value obviously moves that number further. The third on the left there is direct cost reduction. So things like housing, childcare, healthcare together make up over 40% of what a family needs to live in this city. A family with children needs to live in this city. Things like universal childcare moves the cost side, helps to reduce costs, Medicaid expansion, prescription cost relief, and housing supply. And then the last there on the right is really what is in front of this board. So rent, a rent increase obviously raises the housing line of the TCOL for every stabilized tenant in the city, and the populations most exposed to that increase are already short. And just to dive a little bit deeper on this last one here, as Shahab mentioned, 75% of Bronx residents do not meet their true cost of living. 85% of Hispanic residents in Manhattan in particular don't meet their true cost of living. The same goes with 92% of households that have a self-care disability not meeting their true cost of living, and 73% of children living in households that do not meet the true cost of living. So just based on what we've shared, you can also see that a rent increase doesn't always fall evenly on households and families. It falls on the populations that are already missing in the threshold by the widest margins. So beyond this hearing, we also just wanted to share how the TCOL is informing the city's work and our work as an agency. The TCOL is a framework that the city will use to align affordability and work across agencies to do that. These are some of the ways that we will do that. So one is quantifying family economic needs. Identifying the different family types and their specific needs across boroughs, a precise evidence base for where investments should land. So this is really the first time we can fully do that. 2 on the left there is validating key policy investments. So really helps to show how the city's commitments and follow through on things like universal no-cost childcare directly address some of the large cost drivers for working families. And then 3 on the left there, benchmark and track policy impact. This serves as the city's annual measure of whether policies are lowering costs and closing resource gaps over time. So a helpful way for us to track that. And then lastly, driving cross-agency policy action. So providing the framework to align housing, childcare, healthcare, benefits policy, because no single intervention alone can close the gap, and these are all things that work together. They need to work together to do that, including housing costs. And very lastly, we'll just leave you with a few key takeaways. And you can see 5 in front of you here. One that, as Shahab shared, 62% of New Yorkers do not meet their true cost of living. This is overall across the city, about 5 million people. And that's roughly 3 times the official New York City poverty rate. 2, that 73% of New York City children, 1.2 million kids, are living in households that don't meet the true cost of living. Among 2 adult households with children, that's 67%. And the median resource gap is about $49,000 a year. About $4,000 a month. And then 3, 92% of households with a member who has a self-care disability does not meet their true cost of living. The average gap is about $76,000 a year, nearly double the citywide average, as Shahab mentioned, and one of the most affordability constrained groups. And then for the average family with children, do not meet the true cost of living, is short of roughly $49,000 a year, as Shahab mentioned. That's about $4,000 a month of unmet need. After every wage, every benefit, tax credit, all resources are included. And then lastly, rent stabilization is one of the largest and most important sources of low-cost housing in the city. Many New Yorkers are struggling, as we've shared with you, even with that of existing affordability support in place. And lastly, just protecting the existing rent-stabilized housing stock is essential. Rent stabilization obviously is necessary for affordability as one of the largest costs that New Yorkers face. So we'll stop there and move to Q&A, but again, we want to thank you for allowing us to come and testify, and happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Questions from the board? Lauren?
Thanks so much for sharing all of this today. I guess I had 2 questions. I know that this is the first time for your office to publish this analysis, and I'm assuming the intention is to update it on an annual basis. You mentioned so many different amazing data sources that you're combining to do this, including the American Community Survey, which I understand doesn't allow you to do a TCOL analysis specifically of rent-stabilized tenants, correct? So I guess I'm just curious if there's any way, moving forward with this analysis, you all are planning to kind of figure out how to more like directly hone in on the impact of rent stabilization. I know you pulled out those 3 examples, but just on a larger kind of quantitative analysis.
Thank you so much for the question, Lauren. The charter mandates us to update this measure annually, so we intend to do that next year and every year moving forward. As to your question, yeah, we're definitely exploring ways of how we can capture how we can better look at sort of the policy impacts of rent stabilization. We're working, we use sort of the housing vacancy survey data as a great place as a great starting point for that. But we're looking specifically in the future to explore looking at what is the cost for someone to move to New York versus what existing costs New Yorkers face right now.
Other questions?
I have a
Sina?
question.
Oh, sorry.
So I noticed Mr. Williams. Why isn't Mr. Williams on screen?
Did I mention screen as one of the resources?
The middle example of your tenants in distress. He's 72. He's eligible for a rent freeze, as are disabled New Yorkers.
Yeah, I thought I did actually mention that example, but I'll take a look back. My apologies if I
Yeah.
missed it.
I mean, he was one of your examples that it's rent burden, but he's eligible for scree.
Well, I had a similar question overall. I think if in this, where it showed the stacks of both resources and costs, the cost one was broken out by kind of categories, but the resource one, the resource stack just said resource. So it may be, I had a similar question because I know that it says those things are included, tax credit, vouchers, scree injury. But if there's a way to like break it down. Yeah, for either the case studies or the larger bars.
Yeah, happy to provide that.
You mentioned 92% of New Yorkers with disabilities. There's a rent freeze for disabled New Yorkers as well.
Yes, and we do account for that as a resource. So we do account for scree injury as a city-administered resource on the resources side of this. So we were able to impute that and able to account for that in this. So it is a resource that New Yorkers are receiving, and is something that we're able to estimate in sort of the cost in sort of as a resource for New Yorkers in terms of what they have available to them.
Is the mayor's office doing anything to advocate to increase the income threshold for scree injury?
Our office can't speak to that directly, but we're happy to follow up with you.
Okay.
Sina?
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. Given like the size of the resource gaps, I would think that a lot of New Yorkers are also taking on other forms of debt that might not be reflected here. When I think of, the statistics from like the Survey of Consumer Finances that show that the median household that rents has a net worth of $6,900 in the USA, and the costs here, I would think that there's a substantial number of New Yorkers that are actually have like zero or negative net worth. I know that number is about 20% of Americans' households as captured by that survey. So when we are thinking about, rental payments, which aren't, building home equity or net worth and sort of generational sort of sustainability, I would be really curious to sort of capture like those stock variables, not just like flow and expense variables. And I'm wondering if if there could be, if there's thinking around that, or if there's like plans to sort of incorporate that into like that broader measure. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we're exploring at the moment in terms of where the measure could go. So it's helpful to receive some of this feedback. And you're absolutely right. We don't really have a clear picture on how people are or aren't making it work, and taking on debt is one way to do that.
Adon?
Thank you for this presentation. If you don't mind, could you go to maybe, I think, the next slide, or 2 slides after this? Yeah, one more. There we go. So I was just curious, and maybe you had said this, or maybe it was just in some of the font that I couldn't read because it was a bit small. But in terms of the other category, I noticed in a lot of the examples, it was a very large component. Could you speak more to what that's broken out for?
Yeah, for other, we are looking at specifically, there's a lot captured in costs. So we're looking at miscellaneous expenses. So these are things that include, personal care costs, diapers for families, and when they have children, a wide variety of cultural experiences, in dining out, so like eating out, and also just sort of other big pieces around phone, internet, sort of like technology, broadband, those pieces too, household supplies, clothing, so it's all those elements. So, and it's using sort of the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey for the New York City metro area. So, yeah.
Sagar?
Yeah, thank you for doing this. Could you speak more to for families that don't meet the TCOL? Do you have any insight? I think you kind of sort of mentioned it, but like have any further insight on where do they make the cuts to live day to day?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that beautiful question, Sagar. I think, it's something that so many families in New York experience right now. So the true cost of living measure is sort of a measure that's focused on explaining or a descriptive reality of what New Yorkers are experiencing, but it can't necessarily comment on, say, survival strategies. So the things that the choices that folks are making to, when they're faced with sort of what they need to, what their essential costs are and what they're doing to sort of like forego other things to be able to meet their necessary costs. So, yeah. But it's not yet, but it's something we're definitely further interested in exploring, and also really thinking about ways of understanding more about the lived experiences of New Yorkers in that process too. So.
And I guess I'll just say
Adon?
really quickly, the Columbia Poverty Tracker data did speak to the responses from folks who said, like, yeah, the first thing we would cut is X or Y. So I think in conjunction, it helps to paint a powerful picture.
Yes. Yes.
Other questions from the board? Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And now we will welcome the Local Initiative Support Corporation. We'll be hearing from Senior Program Officer Julia Durante Martinez and Vice President David Greenberg. Welcome. We'll wait for folks to come back. Thank you. think we can go ahead and get started.
Good morning, Chair Mitchell and members of the board. Thanks very much for the opportunity to testify today. My name is David Greenberg. I'm Vice President for Community Research and Impact at LISC, the Local Initiative Support Corporation. We are a national community development financial institution and community development intermediary with offices in 34 cities throughout the country and a rural program touching every state and several U.S. territories. Our role at CRI, the Community Research and Impact Team, is to understand the impact of our work and those of our partners, but it's also to understand the conditions and policies that impact the communities that we work with. And it's because of that that we'll be talking today about a 2022 report that we released about housing speculation, affordable investments, and tenant outcomes in New York City. An important focus of our work overall is housing finance, corporate ownership, and tenant and community outcomes, which we have explored through a number of studies. This report was a collaboration with our LISC New York State office. I think our colleague formerly of HPD, Christine O'Connell, was hoping to join. She may be on her way. As well as with the University Neighborhood Housing Program in the Bronx. So the report asked four research questions. Which neighborhoods in New York had seen the most speculation in terms of the housing market, or the characteristics of those places? And then, importantly, what are the consequences of speculation for tenants and communities, focusing on housing quality and evictions? Finally, because we wanted to be able to tell another important side of the story, we looked at the role of affordable housing investments in promoting positive outcomes for tenants and communities, or mitigating against the negative effects of speculation. And the image in the corner is just to note that this research was also published in HUD's Cityscape Journal in 2024 with co-authors Francisca Winston, Jacob Udell, Caroline Kirk, Spencer Anderson, and Rick Hendra. So I'll talk quickly just about some of our methods. It was a mixed method study, but primarily quantitative, drawing heavily on the BIP, the Building Indicator Project database of UNHP. New York, unlike other parts of the country, is blessed for researchers and other stakeholders in having ample public records that cover both sale and debt transactions. And UNHP was a really early path-breaking leader in aggregating these public data sources and linking them to other publicly accessible outcomes, such as code violations. And the database covers multifamilies of 5 or more units throughout New York City. So we combined those data with other sources, including census, eviction records from OCA, and the Furman Center's database on subsidized housing called the SHIP. So the eviction warrants at the building level were meant to understand tenant outcomes together with housing violations. The census data acted as explanatory variables to show where speculation was occurring, but also as control variables to sort of piece out the effects of speculation over and above neighborhood characteristics in the outcomes analysis. And the SHIP was used to understand the potentially protective effects of affordable housing investments. Some really important caveats. The study was a pre-pandemic analysis. We're in the process of updating these findings to understand current patterns of physical and financial distress, as well as where negative tenant outcomes are pooling since the pandemic. Obviously, there are both market and policy changes that may change some of the conclusions that we're about to present. And just the note, while obviously eviction warrants are an incredibly devastating outcome for tenants and communities, we only are looking, I think, at the tip of the iceberg in terms of negative outcomes. These are executed warrants, not filings, and not anything that occurs before filings in terms of tenant displacement pressures. Okay. This is important because there are lots of different ways of defining speculation, but here's what we focused on. So essentially, we were trying to look at the ways that landlords profited through rapid asset appreciation. So there are lots of ways that landlords can profit, including rents, but the major way that speculators profit is by selling their buildings for increased amounts, or by pulling out equity from their buildings, or taking out higher and higher amounts of debt for leveraging it to buy other properties, or for other properties, other types of profitable investments. So what we did was create a kind of repeated measure, looking at the building level to see how much a building was resold, how much it increased in sales price from one sale to the next, or how much additional debt was taken on, adjusting for the time between the sales event or the loan event. So just to play this out, a 12-unit building that doubled in sales price after a year would be treated the same as a similarly sized building that quadrupled in 2 years. So it's time and unit adjusted is the measure. And we started our analysis by just looking at the top quartile of buildings that appreciated the most in this time and unit adjusted measure, which, just to paint a picture of what that threshold was, it was buildings that appreciated by 30% per year on sales, or 50% per year in debt taken out. And I'll turn it over to Julia to talk about findings and recommendations.
Good morning. My name is Julia Durante Martinez. I'm a senior program officer with LISC's Community Research and Impact team, working with David. Thank you again for having us. So to get into some of the findings for the first question, the sort of where speculation is occurring, at the borough level, Manhattan and Brooklyn were places where there was the highest change in sales price throughout the study period. But introducing the census variables at the tract level in regressions that predicted where there were more speculative events gives a much more nuanced story about neighborhood characteristics where speculation is occurring. So I think, the top line finding here is that areas with higher poverty, higher Black and Latino populations also experiencing signs of gentrification experienced more speculation, both in terms of sales price increase and debt, than other neighborhoods. So over the entire period, this areas with higher poverty, higher Black populations, higher Latino populations saw multifamily rentals resold for the greatest increase in price. And when we're talking about signs of gentrification, we're looking at growing percentage of adults with college degrees and a growing population. Very similar story on the debt side of things. And both of these findings are really in line with what advocates have long documented in the context of legacies of disinvestment that create more so-called upside potential that can be captured through these speculative strategies. Another piece of this story is for both sales and debt is how market factors played a role. Of course, the hot market periods from 2004 to 2008 and 2013 to 2017 were associated with greater sales increases and more debt taken out on properties. But even when taking these sort of market cyclical factors and local rent changes into account, race, poverty, and gentrification still predicted speculative sales, though the predictive value decreased somewhat. So all of this is just, to say that trends within the housing market at a given point in time don't tell the entire story of sales price and debt increases. So these hot market indicators are associated with some of the increase in a property's value and the debt taken out, but race, community distress, and gentrification remain important predictors. Go to the next slide. So this is looking at the consequences of speculation for tenants and communities. So some evidence that buildings in this top quartile of speculative sales or debt in 1 year are more likely to remain there in following years, which is again, providing support for what tenant organizers and advocates have long been documenting, that often there are some of the same distressed buildings that are caught in this kind of speculative cycle of resales and increased debt. In terms of housing quality, properties that sold for the highest price or took on the most additional debt had up to 2.7 times more housing violations than others. Across the city, a property that was just sold for a high value in 1 year was more likely to have more housing violations the next year. And that association is even stronger when it comes to debt. Buildings with the highest increase in debt had about 0.78 more maintenance violations per unit per year, which is, again, I think, lending support that when you're looking at this very top quartile of transactions, the debt that is taken out on a property is not actually being reinvested in improving conditions for tenants, and actually is a signal of and potentially a cause of maintenance problems where that debt, where more and more of the building income is going to debt, where it's being invested elsewhere. I think we can, still have to talk about evictions, yeah. So this finding holds true for evictions as well, finding that owners who bought their buildings at the highest price or took on the most debt evicted tenants at up to 1.5 times the rate of owners of similar properties in other neighborhoods. And that a speculative event in the years from 2014 to 2016 predicted the rate of eviction filings per unit from 2017 to 2019, again, even controlling for a number of community characteristics. So sort of to what David was saying at the beginning, over and above the effect of location, poverty, race, and these sort of signals of gentrification, speculative debt, speculative sales are more likely to evict tenants. And this is just a map looking at the zip codes that saw the most speculation, and in this case, the eviction filings at the zip code level, which I don't think is much of a surprise. It's sort of showing these hot spots for both speculation and eviction in Upper Manhattan, the Bronx, Central and Eastern Brooklyn. These are just some tables to show the unadjusted findings or the raw data. So the buildings with speculative sale in 2016 to 2017 being associated with twice the number of violations per unit in 2018 to 2020, and with a speculative debt event during that same period resulting in almost 3 times the number of violations. And similarly here, the unadjusted findings, buildings with any speculative event from 2014 to 2016 had about 2.7 evictions per 100 units from 2017 to 2019, compared to 1.4 per 100 among those that did not. So now sort of turning to the positive side of this research and the protective effects of affordable housing subsidy on multifamily properties. What we found suggests that properties that have some kind of subsidy are overall actually better maintained than unsubsidized housing. When looking across all of the housing units in New York City, and this includes, luxury apartment buildings, new construction, there are anywhere from a half to 2/3 fewer violations in subsidized apartments than in unsubsidized apartments. And these properties also, unsurprisingly, given the regulations around subsidized properties, but were less likely to be acquired at higher values or take on higher levels of debt. And this is something that is even more marked in the Bronx, where on the whole, affordable units have 1/3 to 1/4 the violations compared with other units. So just a table to illustrate that very clearly and reinforce the power of public investments in maintaining not just housing affordability, but also quality of life for tenants. So our research concludes with a number of recommendations that are intended to discourage harmful speculation and to improve outcomes for tenants. Again, as David mentioned at the beginning, our team LISC works nationally. This data is drawn from New York City, but the recommendations we have are also sort of directed at practitioners and policymakers throughout the country. And I know our LISC New York team, along with our colleagues at Enterprise Community Partners, have been engaging with New York City and New York State electeds and policymakers on many of these topics, but just at a very high level, the lanes of recommendations related to strengthening tenant protections and addressing ongoing arrears, as well as strengthening affordable housing operators, particularly given the rising distress that many of them have been facing since this study came out in particular. Expanding code enforcement to protect housing quality, using regulatory tools and oversight to ensure that lenders aren't underwriting to speculative assumptions, what advocates often call displacement financing, and are enforcing good repair clauses. And then strengthening preservation ecosystems, especially related to troubled portfolios, loans that need workouts, and supporting acquisition at scale through providing organizing and technical assistance, capacity building, and fast, flexible financing. So thank you again for the opportunity, and we're happy to answer any questions about the research.
Thank you. Questions from the board? Matt?
I have one. Do you have a sense of the profile of the speculative lenders that, were financing this top 25% quartile?
So it's a great question. We did not include the lenders in this analysis. In some of our work that's ongoing, we are looking sort of at the lender as a unit of analysis as well.
Thank you. For the affordable housing that you included in the study, does that include direct subsidy, tax incentives? Like, what's the profile of type of affordable investments?
Yes to all of those. The SHIP includes, the whole gamut of subsidy, and that's how we flagged it at the building level.
Thank you.
So, sorry, just so I understand, the affordable investment doesn't distinguish between, like HPD subsidy debt and a 421A?
It does within the database, and so you're able to draw that out. So actually, to clarify my comments to the chair, we didn't include 421A in the in our analysis. We're mostly focused on the things that were more sort of classically associated with HPD financing tools.
Okay, thank you.
Sina? Just a comment. I think, it's very interesting analysis, and when we're thinking about violations in our own data set, this equity extraction behavior is a good confounder to try and control for. Yeah.
Other questions from the board? Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
All right. And we will now welcome Emily Eisner, PhD, Acting Executive Director and Chief Economist from the Fiscal Policy Institute.
It's the last thing. Yeah. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Let me just make this big. Is that going to work? Okay. All right. Thanks for having me again. So I think, well, it doesn't really matter, but the presentation I'm giving today is about sort of in response to the income and affordability survey. I think I got sick last month, so I'm a little off schedule here, but yeah, I'll just jump in. So I'll just make some comments on the income and affordability report that came out last month, and talk through sort of how I see the state of tenants in the city over the last few years, including a little bit of discussion about sort of what the sort of how federal policy is impacting the sort of forecast of risks, economic risks for tenants in New York City. I would say that and you all have read it and thought about it a lot already, but the Income and Affordability Survey represents sort of a, let's say, mixed bag and only modest shifts over the most recent year of data. Unemployment is relatively steady in the city, in contrast to at the national level, where we've seen sort of a degradation of unemployment statistics. Real wages are rising over the last few years in New York, at least on average. And the inflation rate, I would say, was normalizing, but is sort of, maybe we have concerns that given the war and tariff policy is actually going to start rising again. And over the last few years, the New York City metropolitan area has seen inflation higher than the national average, especially in its housing. These are charts from the Income and Affordability Survey. I would just like to point out, the chart on the left is sort of demonstrates that real wages have declined over the sort of pandemic years. This is average wages. I prefer to look at it as median real wages because average wages in New York City are so skewed by the top. But even when you look at the median wage, we are still sort of below the pre-pandemic wage that New York City residents had, and that's largely coming from high inflation over the last few years. When you think about that, how housing costs in particular are affecting sort of people's real wage, we have seen, and this is specific to tenants in the city, we've seen median housing costs grow at a faster pace than median incomes. This is true around the country, but it's also the case that in New York City, we've seen a really high growth in the cost of housing for renters relative to their income growth. This is from the Housing and Vacancy Survey, but just to remind you that there's relatively high rates of rent burden, especially for lower income households, and food insecurity is actually quite high for rent-stabilized households. So 20% of rent-stabilized households report being food insecure, which is much higher than sort of the market rentals, which report roughly 13% of households being food insecure. This is now sort of leading into, I'm about to get to this in a minute, but cuts to SNAP and Medicaid threaten these households specifically. We see increased poverty rates over the last few years in New York City, especially in the Bronx, and that's in contrast to the United States as a whole, which has basically seen flat poverty rates. As all of you know, the Bronx in particular sees high poverty rates. I don't assess that there's like extremely high or like a major degradation in the unemployment rate in the Bronx or wages in the Bronx, but there are really quickly rising rents in the Bronx, which do threaten to displace long-term tenants, and rent stabilization is a really big part of mitigating displacement effects when we see these sort of gentrification happening. This is a little bit of a bigger picture assessment on my part, but I guess it's up to you all how to interpret the law, but I see rent stabilization as a policy tool to impact the housing market and not to solve all labor market and economic problems. So the RGB's rent increases do not and should not necessarily sufficiently address chronic unemployment and low wages in New York City. There need to be other fiscal solutions designed to expand social safety nets and offer high-quality jobs to unemployed and underemployed New Yorkers. Nonetheless, in many parts of the city right now, there's gentrification that could lead to significant displacement, especially in the Bronx, and rent stabilization is a part of mitigating that displacement. So I see the biggest risk to New Yorkers as coming from current federal policy and the fact that we're only just recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. The Fiscal Policy Institute has done a ton of work over the last year on the the health insurance impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and the fact that New York State will, in July, basically kick about 450,000 New Yorkers off of their health insurance. Most of those New Yorkers live in New York City or in the metro area, but most of them are in New York City. They're not all. And we expect that number to increase to about 1 million, between 1 and 2 million New Yorkers will lose their public health insurance by 2027. SNAP is the other major effect that we expect it's starting to kick in now. Already 40,000 New Yorkers lost their SNAP benefits, or lost at least the entitlement to SNAP benefits. And we expect work requirements that kicked in March to start threatening SNAP recipients starting, the work requirements kicked in March, and we expect people to start losing benefits in June. And as you can see in the graph, New York City has a huge number of SNAP recipients, especially in the Bronx. And we don't just expect work requirements to affect the people subject to those work requirements, it also increases the bureaucratic standard and kicks off other recipients. Tariffs and the war are going to push prices up. That's already starting to happen in the most recent inflation data. And I don't think I need to say much more about it, but that should be considered when thinking about how inflation will affect household budgets over the next year. And I think that's all I have today. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Questions from the board? Thank you. And I hope you're feeling better.
Thanks.
All right. And now, last but certainly not least, we would like to invite the Independent Budget Office. We'll be hearing from Director Louise Chafee, Senior Research and Strategy Officer Sarah Parker, and Lead Housing Policy and Budget Analyst Sarah Internicola. Welcome.
Thank you. We're going to rustle up another chair.
Oh, great. Yes.
Yeah, you had it before, so I know it's there. Okay, I'll get it. Come on, Sarah. Sorry, we're on the wrong presentation.
No rush.
Under PowerPoint? Nope. Where were they? Sorry. Thank you so much.
Do you see it there?
It came up. It was up before.
Those are older. It would be in one of the bottom ones.
Well, that was the, no. No. I won't let you. We emailed it to you.
It showed up earlier today.
Yeah, it was here. On the downloads.
No?
It's not there.
It was
You
open
had
on
it
the
open
screen.
before.
Okay. Well, it must be there then.
It's not,
That's Lisk.
no, except it doesn't open Lisk. Oh, sorry, like, we saw it open.
Email, Brian, and just download it again.
Just
We
go
saw it
to
open
downloads.
earlier.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't download it, I just opened it from email.
That's why we can't find it.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you.
one, do you see it in this list? The bottom one?
No.
This one?
I think try that one. Yes.
Where's the full screen mode? I'm not sure why it's not doing the full screen mode. Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your patience while we loaded our exciting deck, and thank you for helping. Good afternoon, Chair Mitchell and members of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. My name is Louisa Chafee. I'm the Director of the Independent Budget Office. I'm joined today by Sarah Parker, the Senior Research and Strategy Officer of the IBO, and Sarah Internicola, Lead Budget and Policy Analyst at IBO. We're a government agency, a New York City government agency, whose mission is to enhance understanding of the New York City's budget, public policy, and economy through independent analysis. We appreciate the opportunity to testify at today's public meeting on our agency's recent work on rent-stabilized housing, as published just hours ago. I'm going to hand it to Sarah Parker to discuss segments of the rent-stabilized housing stock.
As you well know, there are about 1 million rent-stabilized apartments in New York City, constituting 41% of the city's rental apartments and 27% of the overall housing stock citywide. Using city and state administrative data, IBO explored different characteristics across the rent-stabilized housing stock. Our analysis focuses on roughly 928,000 stabilized apartments across about 43,000 multiple dwelling A buildings. The characteristics of rent-stabilized buildings IBO analyzed include geography. We looked at this by borough, with Manhattan split into core and upper Manhattan per Rent Guidelines Board definitions, and by the city's community districts. We looked at the year of construction, separating out pre-1974 and post-1973 buildings based on the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974. We looked at median monthly rent of rent-stabilized apartments in rent-stabilized buildings. And we looked at the share of apartments that are rent-stabilized, again calculated at the individual building level. IBO finds that the rent-stabilized stock varies widely on these characteristics. Rent-stabilized housing is spread across the entire city, but there are clear concentrations of rent-stabilized housing, especially in northern Manhattan and the Bronx. You can see this on slide 2, which maps rent-stabilized apartments by community district. 3/4 of the city's rent-stabilized apartments are in pre-1974 buildings. These are buildings that became stabilized under the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974 and remain stabilized today. As shown on slide 3, there are notable patterns in the concentration of pre-1974 rent-stabilized buildings across community districts. Community districts in Eastern Queens, Southwest Brooklyn, Upper Manhattan, and Southern Staten Island have the highest concentrations of pre-1974 buildings. That's the darker shaded areas on the map. We also noted that some community districts have more than half of their stabilized apartments in post-1973 buildings. That's later shaded areas. High shares of post-1973 rent-stabilized apartments appear in areas that have seen major rezonings and new development in recent decades. This includes the Chelsea, Williamsburg, Greenpoint, and downtown Brooklyn neighborhoods. Citywide, the median monthly rent of rent-stabilized apartments, again looking at multiple dwelling Class A buildings, is $1,603, with the bottom quartile of rents at $1,190 or lower, and the top quartile of rents starting at $2,186. Slide 4 shows that there are rent variations by building age. The median rent for a rent-stabilized apartment built before 1974, $1,511, is about $800 lower than the median rent for stabilized apartments built after 1973. The median rent for those buildings being $2,307. Rents for pre-1974 buildings are much more clustered around the median rent. You can see that group, large bundling, tall stacks right around the median for the pre-1973 buildings, whereas they're much more evenly distributed across the entire rent spectrum for post-1973 buildings, distributed from the highest and lowest ends. On slide 4, we show that about a third of all rent-stabilized apartments are in buildings over 90% stabilized, with rents below $1,500. However, there are more rent-stabilized apartments renting at over $2,500 than below $1,000. Also, we'd like to note that about 23% of rent-stabilized apartments are in buildings less than 90% rent-stabilized, and that this also represents a substantial portion of the stock.
Now Sarah will speak to indicators of distress.
Great, thank you. IBO next compares 4 indicators of physical and financial distress in rent-stabilized buildings with non-stabilized rental housing citywide. IBO used the following 4 indicators of distress in its analysis. First, open, hazardous, Class B and C housing maintenance code violations. We next looked at emergency repair program charges going back to January 1st, 2023. These are charges incurred when the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD, fixes hazardous housing code violations that owners fail to correct in a timely manner. ERP charges suggest a property owner unwilling or unable to pay for repairs. We next looked at historical enrollment in Alternative Enforcement Program. This is an HPD program that implements frequent inspections for properties with persistent hazardous housing maintenance code violations and ERP charges. HPD may make repairs to improve physical conditions of housing in this program, and this suggests chronic maintenance issues. Finally, we looked at 2025 tax lien sale eligibility and inclusion. So properties with long overdue property taxes, water or sewer charges, or HPD repair charges can become eligible for the city's tax lien sale. So having a lien sold suggests financial distress in the building if the owner is unable to pay these bills, or possible disinvestment by an owner unwilling to pay the bills. IBO will now present highlights from its analysis of distress across the various segments of the rent-stabilized stock as previously identified. These indicators can complement Rent Guidelines Board research on building net operating incomes to better understand the conditions in rent-stabilized buildings. The causes of distress are influenced by many factors and are beyond the scope of our report. IBO intends to provide an understanding of where distress is present, rather than to describe circumstances underlying these indicators of distress. IBO finds that across all categories of the rent-stabilized stock, the majority of buildings tend to be in similar or better condition compared to citywide non-stabilized averages. There are both newer and older rent-stabilized buildings that show materially better conditions than other non-stabilized rental housing citywide. Although some poor conditions exist, they only characterize a small portion of certain segments of the stock. Next, I'll talk about how we measure distress. First, IBO considered the overall scale of distress across the rent-stabilized stock. IBO found that 28,400 rent-stabilized buildings, or 66% of those analyzed, have a violation rate below the citywide average, showing good conditions. There are also 5,400 rent-stabilized buildings, or 13% of those analyzed, that have at least one hazardous violation per unit. The City Administrative Code defines a distressed property as one with a violation rate of at least 5 hazardous housing maintenance code violations per apartment, among other criteria. IBO identified 600 rent-stabilized buildings, or 1% of those analyzed, with 5 or more hazardous violations per unit. However, these conditions are not limited to rent-stabilized housing. There are an additional 923 non-rent stabilized buildings, or 1.6% of those analyzed, with 5 or more hazardous violations per unit. Housing quality is a concern for a small number of both stabilized and non-stabilized buildings citywide. Next, we looked at where distress is concentrated. IBO looked at distress by median rent of rent-stabilized apartments at the building level, shown here on slide 7. This is broken out by different violation rates and by pre-1974 and post-1973 buildings. Across all categories, IBO finds that the majority of buildings have a violation rate below the citywide non-stabilized average of 0.18 violations per unit. There are relatively higher shares of buildings with higher violation rates among buildings with lower rents, but still, most of these buildings have a lower violation rate than the citywide average. Slide 8 shows the shares of rent-stabilized buildings, again by median rent and building age, which were eligible for the 2025 lien sale and which had their liens sold. The citywide non-stabilized shares are depicted by the horizontal lines on the chart. The citywide non-stabilized shares, nearly 9% of pre-1974 buildings with median stabilized rents under $1,000 were eligible for the lien sale, above the citywide average of 8.3% for non-stabilized rental buildings. All other rent categories were below the citywide non-stabilized average for lien sale eligibility, and all rent categories were below the citywide non-stabilized average for liens sold of 1%. Next, IBO reviewed the same indicators of distress by the share of a building that is rent stabilized, as shown on slide 9. Starting with the same housing maintenance code analysis, IBO again sees that across all categories, the majority of buildings have a violation rate below the citywide average. IBO does find somewhat higher violation rates for buildings that are highly stabilized and built pre-1974, but the pattern is less clear for post-1973 buildings. On slide 10, we look at ERP charges. The green sections show the share of rent-stabilized buildings with average ERP charges per unit above the non-stabilized average. As the share of a building that is rent-stabilized increases, we see that the share of buildings above the non-stabilized ERP average also increases. However, the share of rent-stabilized buildings above the non-stabilized average is only as high as 22% and as low as 3% across these different categories. IBO assessed the same distress indicators by building location using the borough-based geographies that the Rent Guidelines Board uses in its research. Here the greatest contrasts arise, looking at housing maintenance code violation rates by borough in slide 11. IBO finds that less than half of pre-1974 buildings in the Bronx and Upper Manhattan have a violation rate below the citywide average. Meanwhile, buildings in other boroughs show a majority with a lower violation rate than the citywide average, as high as 80% in core Manhattan. This is further shown in slide 12, where we look at AEP enrollment rates, where pre-1974 buildings in the Bronx, Upper Manhattan, and Brooklyn show rates of AEP enrollment above the non-rent stabilized average of 2.4%. These properties in the Bronx specifically reach 10% AEP enrollment.
So in conclusion, rent-stabilized housing varies widely across the stock by building age, median rents, location, and the share of the building stabilized. Across and within these categories, there are also a wide range of conditions present. IBO finds that the majority of rent-stabilized buildings show conditions similar to or better than citywide non-stabilized building averages. Where distress does exist in the rent-stabilized stock, it tends to be concentrated in pre-1974 buildings that are lower rent, highly stabilized, or located in the Bronx or Upper Manhattan. Even among these segments, however, distress affects only a small portion of these buildings, while many show conditions better than citywide averages. Housing quality concerns are thus not limited to rent-stabilized housing, but rather affect a portion of all rental housing citywide. Rent guidelines are not designed to address the specific needs of individual buildings, but rather to provide year-to-year rent predictability for tenants. Rate setting is only one of many tools shaping outcomes for rent-stabilized housing, owners, and tenants, and should be distinguished from broader housing policies and preservation programs intended to address underlying building concerns. There are many public policy tools that could be implemented to address distress for different subsets of buildings. Doing so would allow the city to consider policies to further preserve this housing for owners and tenants. We thank you for the opportunity to testify and look forward to answering any questions you may have. And for IBO's full analysis, please go to our website. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Questions from the board? Arpit?
Yeah, thank you so much for your testimony and your report. If you can go back to the income graph or the rent graph, you had the distribution of rents. Yeah, this one right here. So this is just something that I think would be great if your team could think about analyzing in the future, which is the vacancy or occupation or utilization of the stock. What you can see here on your graph is you have this mass of people right at zero. And your note there says those are people who may be owner occupied, superintendent occupied, or temporarily exempt. So I just find that an interesting, kind of segment of the stock, the number of units that are not occupied. We have data from HCR last year that indicated 50,000 rent-stabilized units were vacant or not occupied. There are other signs of vacancy. So the estimate that I hear is between 800 and 900,000 of the rent-stabilized units actually have a lease on them out of the 1 million. I don't know if that number is true. Like, someone can definitely correct me on that. But that's my point, is like, I think understanding the true utilization, the true occupancy, true vacancy of the stock would be a tremendous service for somebody to do. You're an independent budget organization, so I feel like you might be one such organization to look at that.
I do want to just clarify this analysis. We did not include any apartments that were registered as vacant with a rent of 0, because that is not how property owners are instructed to fill out that information. It's supposed to be vacant with whatever the legal rent, or if it's vacant, I guess there isn't a preferential rent. So those were not included in our analysis.
Yeah, but I would almost call this like shadow vacancy. These are units that could go to the public, that could be used by renters in the population, and for one reason or another, they're going to some other use that is not providing rents.
Mm-hmm. And the piece about some of these with $0 is if they're being used by a superintendent or a temporary exempt because a family member is living there, it's occupied, but it's not on the market as an apartment either by a tenant or by vacancy. So that also makes that category a difficult one to disentangle. It's a great point of research.
Yeah.
We've been really interested in vacancies and vacancies from year to year. This was something that we did a report on in 2023, looking at coming out of the COVID pandemic changes that we saw in rental markets. We saw an increase in vacancies, but then we saw that of things that had been vacant for more than 1 year in a row, that they were starting to be rented up. This is something that we're looking into and interested in.
Yeah, I mean, just very quick on that point, we saw the same thing with the HCR records, that there was this increase in vacancy post-pandemic. It went down, but the latest number from last year was that it then increased substantially, right? So that's just something I think is worth somebody else looking into.
No, that's a great suggestion. We've taken note. Thank you.
Max, did you have a question? Oh, sorry. Yeah, Sina?
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I had a question about the lien kind of sale and eligibility slide on 8. I'm just curious if you have any sort of, well, one, like what, like, is it like all liens on rent stabilized units that, like, I would like love to learn a little bit more about what kind of liens are included in this analysis. And I'm also curious about like why the pattern sort of flips by sort of median rent for pre-1974, where it's sort of decreasing by rent, and then it's increasing by rent for post-73. If you have any thoughts on why that might be the case.
Yeah, just to your first question, we did look at all types of liens for these properties, so it's just an overall eligibility and rate of sale. I don't know if you'd want to speak to the second question.
I mean, this is a problem as data researchers. We can't always get to the why underneath. So as you point out, there is with rents, the share of eligibility does go down for the pre-74 category, and then there's much more subtle variation on the post-73. We can't say why.
Adon?
I just want to ask a follow-up on the temporary exemption question. Is that data pulled almost exclusively from the HCR rent registrations, or because I could see with the superintendent there might be other data sources, but For the temporary exemption specifically, is it just the registration?
So those are apartments indicated as temporary exempt in the HCR data.
Okay. And I could see why that would be a huge problem, because we've seen like throughout the decades that there have been both intentional and unintentional mistakes or incorrect data about temporary exemption for the purpose of either deregulating them or just, you know, a slew of issues. Not to mention the fact that they're capped at like a certain amount of years that they're temporarily exempt, and then they're supposed to go back online. So, okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
The vast majority of those are supers, though, right? Like, it was only.
That's our understanding. And a lot of them, even in the label of who lives there, is superintendent.
Andrew?
I would just like to echo, as data researchers, we don't always know why. Thank you for saying that. It's the best testimony I've heard ever since I've been here. But seriously, the difference between our data and our report, when we did violations, it was opened, all opened in a calendar year, whether they were closed or remained open. Correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking about opened, that were still open in a calendar year, right?
Yes.
Okay, so if you're,
Open and issued since January 1st, 2023.
they were open, but whether, we look at it as, in the data we did, so 2025, if there was a violation opened, that's what we consider, whether it was closed in that time or not. You guys just, if it was opened, meaning that it was still opened, rather than, is that correct to say?
Yes.
Okay.
Other questions? Thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Any discussion from the board? All right, motion to adjourn? We're adjourned.